Imagine waking up tomorrow and finding out that nearly a third of the world's entire oil supply has been cut off. Not because of a war, not because of a natural disaster, but because one country, one narrow strip of water, decided the world had pushed it too far. Gas prices don't just go up, they explode. Supply chains collapse. Economies that were already on the edge start falling off. And the worst part? This isn't some far-fetched nightmare scenario cooked up by a Hollywood writer. This is a real threat, on the table right now in 2025. Iran has once again raised the possibility of closing the Strait of Hormuz. And this time, the words are coming from the highest levels of their military and government. If you think this doesn't affect you because you're sitting thousands of miles away from the Persian Gulf, stay with me, because by the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly why every single person watching this, whether you're in Texas, Ohio, California, or anywhere else in America, has a direct stake in what happens in that tiny stretch of water. This is Federal Alert, and today we are breaking down one of the most dangerous geopolitical flashpoints of our time. Before we go any further, if you haven't already, hit that like button right now and subscribe to Federal Alert. We cover the stories that actually matter, the ones with real consequences for real people. And we make sure you understand them without the noise. Subscribe so you never miss a critical update like this one. Let's start with geography, because geography is destiny in this story. The Strait of Hormuz is a narrow body of water sitting between Iran on one side and the United Arab Emirates and Oman on the other. At its narrowest point, it is only about 21 miles wide. 21 miles. That's roughly the distance from downtown Manhattan to Newark, New Jersey. Yet through that impossibly small corridor, approximately 20 to 21 million barrels of oil pass every single day. That represents somewhere between 20 and 30% of all the oil traded globally. Add to that a massive share of the world's liquefied natural gas shipments, and you begin to understand why this strait is not just important. It is perhaps the single most critical choke point in the entire global energy infrastructure. There is no easy detour. There is no highway you can reroute traffic to. If the Strait of Hormuz closes, the pain is immediate, it is severe, and it is worldwide. Now let's talk about why we are here, in this moment, with Iran once again making this threat. To understand what's happening today, you have to understand the pressure that has been building for years. The United States and Iran have been locked in a confrontation that goes back decades, but the most recent and most intense chapter began when the Trump administration, in its first term, withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal in 2018 and reimposed sweeping economic sanctions on Tehran. Those sanctions were designed to strangle Iran's economy by cutting off its ability to export oil. The logic was called maximum pressure. Squeeze Iran so hard financially that it would either come back to the negotiating table on much stricter terms or face an economic collapse that would force a change in behavior. Iran did come back to some negotiations, but the fundamental standoff never really resolved. Fast forward to today, with the Trump administration back in power in its second term, and that maximum pressure approach has been cranked up even further. The United States has made clear that it intends to reduce Iran's oil exports as close to zero as possible. Not just reduce them, eliminate them. And Iran's response has been exactly what many analysts feared. When you back a country into a corner, when you tell them that you are going to cut off their economic lifeline entirely, they start looking for leverage. And Iran's biggest piece of leverage, perhaps the most consequential piece of leverage any single country holds anywhere on Earth, is its ability to threaten and potentially act on the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. Iranian military, commanders and senior government officials have now stated explicitly that if the United States continues what Iran describes as an economic blockade, closing the strait is on the table. These aren't vague hints. These aren't diplomatic code words that require interpretation. Iranian officials have used direct, unambiguous language. They have reminded the world that they have the military capability to at least significantly disrupt shipping through the strait using mines, missiles, drones, and naval vessels. And they want Washington and the world to know they are serious. Here's what you need to understand about the credibility of this threat, because this is where it gets complicated. Iran has made this threat before, multiple times over. The past decade and a half, Iranian officials have raised the specter of closing Hormuz during periods of tension. Each time, oil markets have reacted with anxiety. Each time, the strait has remained open. So is this just Iran crying wolf again? Is this the same old playbook being run one more time? The honest answer is, maybe. But here's why this time feels different to analysts who watch this region for a living. The pressure on Iran today is more intense than it has been at almost any previous point in the modern era. Their oil revenues have been dramatically reduced. Their economy is under severe strain. The political situation internally in Iran is fragile. And perhaps most importantly, Iran's relationships with some of its traditional allies and partners have been shifting, partly as a result of the Abraham Accords and the broader realignment happening across the Middle East. Iran is not in a position of growing strength. It is in a position of growing desperation. And desperate nations sometimes do things that rational actors would not. There's another factor that makes this moment uniquely dangerous, and Federal Alert wants to make sure you fully grasp this. Iran is not operating in isolation. The broader context around it matters enormously. Iran has been deepening its relationships with Russia and China. Both of those countries have strategic interests in seeing American dominance in the Persian Gulf region challenged. Russia, bogged down in its war in Ukraine, has every incentive to see oil prices spike globally, because higher oil prices benefit Russian revenues even amid Western sanctions. China, locked in its own escalating trade and economic confrontation with the United States, has reasons to quietly support any development that complicates America's strategic position. Neither Russia nor China is going to openly tell Iran to close the strait. But neither are they going to spend significant diplomatic capital telling Iran not to. This creates an environment where Iran may feel less restrained than it might have in a different geopolitical landscape. Now let's talk about what actually happens, practically, step by step. If Iran were to move toward closing or seriously disrupting the Strait of Hormuz, the first thing that would happen, likely before a single mine is laid or a single missile is fired, is that oil markets would go into panic mode. We're talking about the kind of price spike that would make the 1973 oil embargo look moderate by comparison. Analysts have estimated that a serious, credible move toward closing the strait could send oil prices to anywhere between $130 and $200 per barrel or higher, depending on how markets read the severity of the threat. Now translate that into what you pay at the pump. If you think gas at $3.50 or $4 a gallon is painful, imagine $7, $8, or even higher. Imagine those prices not just in the immediate aftermath, but sustained over weeks or months, while a crisis plays out diplomatically and potentially militarily. That is not a scenario that sounds like someone else's problem. That is a scenario that hits every American family directly in the wallet, every single time they fill up their car, heat their home, or buy groceries that had to be shipped across the country. But the economic pain doesn't stop at the gas pump, not even close. Energy costs are baked into the price of almost everything. When fuel becomes dramatically more expensive, transportation costs rise. When transportation costs rise, the price of food goes up, the price of manufactured goods goes up, the cost of running a business goes up. Airlines raise ticket prices, shipping companies raise rates, farmers, who use enormous amounts of diesel to run their equipment, face skyrocketing operating costs that ultimately get passed on to consumers. And this is happening at a moment when inflation is already a serious concern for many American households. The economic ripple effects of a genuine Hormuz crisis would be felt across every sector of the American economy and probably the global economy in ways that would take years to fully work through. What about the United States military response? Because if Iran tries to close the strait, the U.S. is not going to sit back and watch. The American military presence in the Persian Gulf and surrounding region is substantial. The United States' Fifth Fleet is based in Bahrain. American aircraft carriers and their battle groups operate in the region regularly. The U.S. military has spent decades developing capabilities specifically designed to keep critical sea lanes open and to deter exactly this kind of threat. If Iran were to begin laying mines in the strait or attacking commercial shipping with missiles or drones, which is something Iran-backed forces have actually done in recent years, targeting tankers with various weapons, the United States would almost certainly respond militarily. The question is what that military response looks like, how Iran responds to that response, and whether the whole situation escalates into something far larger and far more dangerous than either side originally intended. This is the classic escalation risk that keeps defense planners and foreign policy experts up at night. You start with economic sanctions. The other side threatens to close a strait. You start naval operations to protect shipping. They attack a ship. You strike a military target. They respond, and suddenly you're in a conflict that nobody planned for, and nobody knows how to end. History is full of wars that started with limited, calculated moves that both sides assumed they could control, only to spiral into something catastrophic. The Iran-U.S. relationship is particularly prone to this kind of miscalculation because the two countries have no direct diplomatic communication channel at the highest levels. They have deeply entrenched domestic political pressures on both sides that make compromise look like weakness, and they have a long history of reading each other's signals incorrectly. Let's take a step back and talk about Iran's decision-making calculus more carefully, because this is something Federal Alert wants you to really think about. Iran's leadership is not monolithic. There are different factions with different views about how far to push, what risks are acceptable, and what the ultimate goal is. The hardline elements within Iran's Revolutionary Guard and certain political circles genuinely believe that confronting American power, even at great cost, is necessary to preserve the Islamic Republic's revolutionary identity and long-term survival. For these factions, the threat to close Hormuz is not just a negotiating chip. It's an expression of resistance to what they see as American imperialism. On the other hand, there are more pragmatic voices in Iran who understand that actually closing the strait would invite a devastating military response that could set back Iran's military and economic infrastructure by years, if not decades. The question of which faction's voice is actually driving policy at any given moment is one that outside analysts often get wrong, and that uncertainty itself is a source of danger. There's also the question of what Iran's actual goal is. On the surface, the demand is simple: end the sanctions, end what Iran calls the American economic blockade, allow Iran to sell its oil freely on international markets. But beneath that surface demand are deeper questions about regional power, about the legitimacy of Iran's nuclear program, about Iran's role as a regional power broker through its relationships with groups like Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, and various militia groups in Iraq and Syria. The United States isn't just trying to stop Iran from selling oil. It's trying to constrain what it sees as Iran's destabilizing behavior across an entire region. And Iran isn't just trying to sell oil. It's trying to secure its position as a major regional power. These are not misunderstandings that can be resolved with a quick phone call. These are fundamental conflicts of interest that have been building for nearly half a century. Now, some of you watching this are probably thinking, okay, but America has been pretty energy independent in recent years, right? The shale revolution, domestic production, all of that. Why should a disruption in the Persian Gulf matter as much as it used to? This is a really important question, and the answer reveals something crucial about how global oil markets actually work. Yes, the United States has dramatically increased its domestic energy production over the past 15 years, but oil is a global commodity. It trades on a global market. When the price of oil goes up because of a crisis in the Persian Gulf, the price goes up everywhere in the world, including for American consumers, regardless of where the oil is actually produced. American shale oil doesn't have a special discount price for Americans. It sells at or near whatever the global market price happens to be. So even if not a single barrel of Hormuz oil directly enters an American port, a crisis that sends global oil prices to $180 a barrel will raise gas prices in Iowa just as surely as it will raise them in Tokyo or London. Beyond that, many of America's closest allies are much more directly dependent on Persian Gulf oil than the United States is. Countries like Japan, South Korea, Germany, France, and others get significant portions of their energy from the Gulf region. If their economies are severely disrupted by a Hormuz closure, the ripple effects hit the United States through trade, relationships, financial markets, and the broader global economic system. The world's economies are deeply interconnected, and an economic shock of the magnitude that a genuine Hormuz closure would create does not stay contained to one region. It spreads, and Federal Alert has been tracking these interconnections for exactly this reason, because what happens in a 21-mile strait halfway around the world can and does end up on your doorstep. Let's talk about what the diplomatic landscape looks like right now and whether there's a realistic path out of this escalation spiral before it reaches a genuinely dangerous point. The United States' position, as articulated by the Trump administration, is essentially that it will not lift economic pressure on Iran unless Iran makes fundamental changes, not just to its nuclear program, but to its entire regional posture, including its support for proxy groups across the Middle East. From Washington's perspective, maximum pressure worked in the first term to bring Iran back to the negotiating table, and maintaining or increasing that pressure is the best way to force genuine concessions. Iran's position is equally firm. It will not accept what it sees as humiliating demands that strip it of its regional influence and strategic depth. From Tehran's perspective, the nuclear program and the relationships with regional partners are existential security guarantees in a neighborhood full of adversaries, and no amount of economic pressure will cause Iran to surrender those assets. This is what diplomats call a wicked problem, a situation where both sides have deeply held positions that are logically consistent from their own perspective, but directly incompatible with each other. And the dangerous middle ground between two irreconcilable positions is often where conflicts start. The lack of direct, meaningful diplomatic contact between Washington and Tehran makes it even harder to find face-saving off-ramps that might allow both sides to de-escalate without appearing to have capitulated. Some regional actors, Qatar, Oman, and others, have historically played quiet intermediary roles between the U.S. and Iran, and there may be back-channel conversations happening that aren't being reported publicly. But given the public postures on both sides right now, any diplomatic off-ramp would require significant political courage from leaders who don't appear to be in a particularly conciliatory mood. There's one more dimension of this story that Federal Alert thinks deserves serious attention, and it's something that doesn't get discussed enough in the mainstream coverage of this topic. That's the role of non-state actors and what we might call the escalation by accident or escalation by proxy problem. Iran has, over the years, developed a sophisticated network of allied and proxy forces across the region. The Houthis in Yemen, Hezbollah in Lebanon, various militia groups in Iraq, and others. These groups operate with varying degrees of Iranian direction and control. In some cases, Iran can essentially tell them what to do. In other cases, these groups have their own agendas and their own decision-making processes that Iran influences but doesn't fully control. We've already seen the Houthis attacking commercial shipping in the Red Sea in recent years, which required a significant U.S.-led military response. We've seen drone and missile attacks on American bases in the region. Any of these actions, taken at the wrong moment by a group that miscalculates how far it can push, could trigger a chain of events that neither the United States nor Iran actually wants, but that neither can easily stop once it starts. The other wild card in this equation is Israel. Israel views Iran's nuclear program as an existential threat. Israel has conducted operations inside Iran. The sabotage of nuclear facilities, the killing of nuclear scientists, drone strikes. Israel has made clear that it will not allow Iran to develop a nuclear weapon and that it reserves the right to take military action to prevent that. The relationship between Israel and the United States under the current administration is very close. If Israel were to conduct a major strike against Iranian nuclear or military facilities, Iran would almost certainly respond, and that response could very well include action in the Strait of Hormuz. So the Hormuz threat doesn't exist in isolation. It's connected to the nuclear standoff, which is connected to Israeli security calculations, which are connected to American political dynamics. It's a web of interconnected risks, where pulling on one thread can cause unexpected things to unravel in other places. So where does this all leave us? What's the realistic scenario going forward? There are several possible paths, and it's worth being clear about each of them. The first and most hopeful path is that back-channel diplomacy produces some kind of quiet agreement, perhaps a partial easing of sanctions in exchange for Iranian commitments on the nuclear program, that reduces the temperature enough to make the Hormuz threat recede. This has happened before in various forms, and there are intermediaries with the relationships and the motivation to try to make it happen again. The second path is that the current standoff continues. Iran keeps making the Hormuz threat. The United States maintains its sanctions pressure. Both sides avoid taking actions that would force an actual kinetic confrontation, and the situation simmers at a high but manageable level of tension indefinitely. This is actually the most historically common outcome in Iran-US confrontations. A lot of heat, a lot of threatening language, but neither side ultimately willing to pay the price of actual conflict. The third path, and the one that keeps everyone in Washington, Riyadh, Tel Aviv, and every major oil-importing capital in the world awake at night, is that something goes wrong. A miscalculation, an accident, a provocation by a third party, a domestic political crisis in Iran that shifts internal power dynamics in a dangerous direction. Something triggers a sequence of events that leads to actual conflict in and around the Strait of Hormuz. This path doesn't require either side to want a war. It just requires the gap between their positions to remain unbridgeable while the pressure keeps building, until the structure finally cracks under the strain. What should the American public be paying attention to as this situation develops? First, watch the oil markets. They're often the most sensitive real-time indicator of how seriously the professional risk community is taking the Hormuz threat. When traders start pricing in a genuine disruption risk, you'll see it in prices, before you see it in headlines. Second, watch the movements of American naval assets in the region. The positioning of carrier strike groups, the deployment of minesweeping vessels, and the level of U.S. naval activity in the Persian Gulf are all indicators of how the military is assessing the threat level. Third, watch the diplomatic signals. Not the public statements, which are almost always calibrated for domestic consumption on both sides, but the quieter signals from intermediaries like Oman and Qatar about whether anyone is actually talking to anyone else. Federal alert exists precisely for moments like this one, because in a world that is moving faster and getting more complex every single day, having a clear, honest, well-researched analysis of the forces that are actually shaping your future is not a luxury. It's a necessity. And what we've walked through today, the geography of Hormuz, the history of the Iran-US confrontation, the economic stakes for ordinary Americans, the military and diplomatic dimensions, the role of regional proxies and third parties, all of this comes together to paint a picture of a situation that deserves your serious attention. Not panic, not fatalism, but serious, clear-eyed attention. Because here's the bottom line. The Strait of Hormuz is not just a shipping lane, it is a pressure gauge for the entire global order. When that gauge is spiking, and right now, it is spiking. It tells us something important about the underlying tensions in the international system. It tells us that the rules and relationships and agreements that have kept the Persian Gulf stable enough to allow global commerce to function are under serious strain. And when those structures strain far enough, they sometimes break. The question of whether that happens here, whether we navigate this crisis with the intelligence and the diplomatic skill it requires, is one of the most consequential questions facing American foreign policy right now. Before we wrap up, Federal Alert wants to hear from you. Drop a comment below. Do you think Iran will actually close the Strait of Hormuz, or is this just leverage? Do you think the U.S. sanctions policy is the right approach? Or is maximum pressure creating more danger than it prevents? We read your comments, we take them seriously, they help shape what we cover next. And if you found this breakdown valuable, if you learned something today that you didn't know before, please share this video. Share it with someone who thinks foreign policy doesn't affect them. Share it with someone who wants to understand what's really happening in the world beyond the 5-second headlines. That's how Federal Alert grows. That's how we keep doing what we do. Hit the share button right now and get this into the hands of someone who needs it. Stay sharp. Stay informed. This is Federal Alert, and we'll see you in the next one.